IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I am Bharat Sharma and I'm joined by my colleague Bharath Reddy, who's a researcher at the Takshashila Institution. Welcome to All Things Policy.
Hi Bharat, it's good to have a podcast with two Bharats.
Today we're going to speak about something that might be really opaque to certain listeners. We're going to speak about Open Radio Access Network, or short for, or you can also call it the Open RAN. And we're going to speak about we're going to lay the land of the Indian telecommunications industry and the telecom network systems and how Open RAN has kind of played a role within the industry itself. So just to begin with, before we kind of jump to specific questions, what is, an open radio access network? I mean, what is a closed radio access network? I mean, the opposite of that case, right? I mean, how exactly when people ask you about Open RAN, how exactly do you explain its role, its significance, what itself it means, this particular term?
So before we get into what Open RAN is, let's talk about what the RAN is. So RAN stands for Radio Access Networks. And this is the last mile connectivity. That's what connects your mobile phone to the tower. So that thing the connectivity which enables you to send text messages, calls. So all that, the connecting your mobile to the base stations or the mobile towers, which are deployed in large numbers across the country. So that part is called the radio access network. Now, because it's deployed in such vast numbers across the country, it makes up a large part of the capex cost of these operators. So around 60% is, some of the estimates say that it's around that much. So it's a big part of the investment. And so that's the RAN, right? So, and when you look at how the vendors of this RAN equipment sell it, so it's usually as an end-to-end solution. You have a lot of different components which are being put together to build something like this, and it's sold as a complete system. So you can't take different parts from different vendors and put it together or something like that. So that's like you can think of it as a black box. You go to a vendor, buy a base station kind of a thing, and that vendor might in turn be sourcing it from other suppliers and labeling it and all of that. But as a operator, when I say operator, I mean the likes of Airtel or Vodafone or Jio or whoever it is. So they go and buy from these vendors. And you can think of the vendors as, say, an Ericsson or Nokia or Huawei, ZTE. All of these were the big, RAN vendors. And all of these were tightly integrated systems. You were getting one kind of end-to-end system. So now what happens is these operators, not just in India, but across the world, they felt that they were not having too many options. There was not too much of competition amongst this vendor in that ecosystem. So, and it's a pretty difficult market to enter because you have to develop a system which requires expertise in a lot of different areas, and starting from the radio to the networking side to all of these, the intelligence that's required in the base station itself. So all of these things, you need someone with expertise across all of these areas to build something like this. And very few companies had that kind of thing, and they've built that kind of knowledge over many decades. And there were just a handful of companies across the world. Now, so what the operators have felt is that there's not too much of choice. So let's try to push for an initiative which will get more competition in. So we will try to push for a standard which will say that you don't need to you don't need a integrated end-to-end system. We want interoperable sub-components of these systems, which can be developed by smaller.
So that's interesting. I mean, is it the case that, what kind of felt like that these vendors kind of wanted more competition? The outcome, was it that innovation was lacking in the system? Was it that there was a need for, cost-effective equipment we manufactured? Was that the kind of the factor that led to this kind of Open RAN deployment that you speak about? When you say competition led to kind of looking at multiple vendors and how we can manage that system. On that, what are the challenges that these vendors faced so that, it led to kind of this revolution on, something you can call, the introduction of Open RAN. Yeah, how would you characterize its entry itself? I mean, what factors kind of influence that?
So the operators were the ones initiating this. So you have alliances which were formed. One of them is the ORAN Alliance, which was, I think, a merger between an alliance called CRAN in China and another one called XRAN, I guess. So, and all of these were operator. When I say operator, it's like Airtel and Jio and Vodafone and operators like that across the world. So they are the primary advocates for this technology, because you have the incumbents who are these big vendors who are happy with the way things are, right? So they have a end-to-end solution. There are very few players in the market, and it's tough for someone new to enter, because someone who's a new entrant will have to build that entire solution to be able to compete. And it requires a lot of expertise.
So just sorry to interrupt you, but so it's that there's the revolution or the introduction itself. I mean, the operators are at the forefront. So I want to kind of distinguish for our listeners the kind of, this what you spoke about between the distinction between vendors and operators. I mean, so that kind of, I mean, in the system itself, there's a kind of, the role itself that they play are two different kind of roles. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So like I was saying, the operators came together in different regions. One, the XRAN Foundation in the US and the CRAN Consortium in China. So these were, and they came together to form the ORAN Alliance. Now, the biggest operators who made this happen were AT&T, China Mobile, Deutsche Telekom, NTT Docomo, Orange, all of these big operators across the world. So they wanted more choice so obviously choice is good. The more choice you have, there's more competition.
More choice, more competition, more innovation with respect to how vendors function. Right.
You want all of that. So as in operators, so they decided that they're going to set the standard and they're going to try to push for it. And maybe smaller companies will come up which can address niche parts of these things, which they can specialize in. And you can integrate all of these different components and build a system which works end to end. So you don't have to be reliant on one supplier, but you can have different suppliers for different.
No, sorry. So just to, I don't understand. So what exactly, I mean, what's the harm with a single vendor? I mean, so you mentioned there's lack of competition. There's the same players in the market. Probably it's a threat to innovation, for example. But I mean, are those the concerns that, these operators were looking for when they saw that, this single vendor kind of maintains a monopoly, or few of these vendors maintain monopolies over the market? So I mean, was that the larger concern behind kind of forming these alliances that you speak about?
So I think 2 or 3 vendors, which is Huawei, Ericsson and Nokia, they had like the vast majority of the market in this.
Right.
And this is a pretty big, like I was saying, that it's one of the biggest capex expenditures for an operator. And you're reliant on a handful of suppliers. Now, what has happened in the past few years is that Chinese vendors like Huawei and ZTE have been banned from deploying equipment in different countries
because of national security.
A lot of concerns that nations have raised. So it might be that there's threats of espionage or network sabotage or whatever it is. India has banned these vendors from deploying equipment. I think US, Australia, some countries in Europe as well. So a lot of countries have taken these kind of actions to ban this thing. And as a result of that, the vendor pool becomes even more concentrated.
Right.
And you will not, given the kind of market that it is, you will not have new entrants coming in because it requires a lot of expertise and it requires a lot of investment. And so naturally, you would not expect someone to be able to come and compete with these. So that's probably a reason why these offshorers try to push for a more standardized interface between these subcomponents so that new players could come and address smaller parts of that and build components.
So just jumping to, so we now talked about the challenge that eventually led to the Open RAN solution, so to speak. And kind of this document that you've published, a discussion document on just Open RAN and challenges and recommendations and so on. I mean, recommendations for the deployment of Open RAN. And you mentioned that the point of Open RAN is in some sense to enhance vendor diversity, to promote interoperability. As you said, bring new players in the market, have a standard, be clear about what the rules of the game are. What challenges do you see in this deployment? I mean, first of all, the question itself is, why do countries care about this? So obviously companies have, they want, as you mentioned, they want some kind of diversification, they want vendor diversity. There's other host of concerns. But, recently the Quad, which comprises the US, Japan, India, and Australia, they've said they want to enhance this deployment of Open RAN, beginning with, kind of trial versions in the Pacific and so on. I mean, so what do countries have to do with this deployment? I mean, one concern, you can speak about this, but one concern might be that, China has a significant hold of this kind of industry. And given the national security concerns that kind of raises, obviously countries like the US will take charge in kind of advocating for this deployment itself. So if you could mention, how is it that geopolitics kind of influences, the deployment of Open RAN? And for our listeners, I think just for clarity, what part of Open RAN is open? How would you characterize the openness of a radio access network?
I'll take them one by one. So a bunch of questions. So let me get to the geopolitics around Open RAN first. So why is it that, so this is a esoteric telecom industry term. So why is it being seen in, bilateral technology partnership or in a Quad summit? Why are these discussions happening around? So if you look at all the countries that are pushing for Open RAN, it might be the US, it might be India, it might be, I think, UK, the Quad countries, which is Japan, Australia, and the others. So you see that all of them are, so now they're dependent on these telecom vendors. Now, most of them have imposed bans on Chinese vendors, and they're reliant on the other few vendors which are left, right? So those are either Nokia, Ericsson, or Samsung, which are the three biggest vendors who have the largest market.
Just for our listeners as well, how exactly did it come about that companies like Huawei and ZTE pose national security concerns? What part of a radio access network is a national security risk? How exactly would you characterize the risk involved?
So the reason why these companies were blacklisted from deploying networks in all of these countries were that for two reasons, basically. One is that there's a threat that they could snoop on the data, because all of the data that you access passes through these networks, right? So there is a possibility that it could be intercepted, and they would have visibility to what all the conversations, all the data that's going through the networks. So that's one thing. So how feasible that is, and is there evidence?
And that's a huge national security concern, right? It focuses not just at a very broad strategic level. It's something that...
So it's still, a lot of the data that we use is encrypted, right? So if it's on any of your messaging apps, or even if you're accessing a website, it's on an encrypted, between the server and the client, it's an encrypted channel. And it would not be very easy to break that encryption and to have visibility what everyone is doing. So that's still one concern, that it could be done, or at least if you don't have the exact data, maybe you have some metadata about who's accessing what at what time and things like that. So apart from that, the other concern is that they could, if you are reliant on an adversary, for a company that's in an adversary country, potential adversary countries, and that's deploying large parts of your telecom network. And if there's a conflict that arises in the future, and this is a company which has close ties to the state, the Chinese state, and the laws are such that the state has visibility to the operations of the company, can influence the company and all of that. So it's a potential threat that maybe if a conflict situation were to arise, your network could be taken down in that kind of situation. And this is a situation you don't want to be in. You don't want a complete blackout just if some situation were to arise on the border.
Yeah, I think in 2019 or so, there was a blackout in Mumbai. And I think the Washington Post had released kind of a report saying that the Chinese were behind it. So that was, I think, one case where this kind of said, at least for me as a researcher, kind of became real. That it's not just that we talk about potential risks involved. And, as conflict kind of rises and potential adversary becomes more concrete as an adversary, these risks kind of become amplified. So we were speaking about...
Right, so all of these countries have taken these actions. Right? So all of these countries now, operators in all of these countries have very few options to choose, which are these three companies, which are Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung, which are the large vendors. And you have a few other Now, what happens is that what you've seen over the past few years is that technology, geopolitics is increasingly getting entangled. States are using technology as a means to coerce other countries to, take certain actions, deny access to a technology. So in this kind of a environment, or at least for the critical infrastructure, you want some kind of a resilient supply chain. You don't want to be dependent on one country, which can then cut off, support or future.
You don't want to be critically dependent on any other.
So in that context, that's why you would think that all of these countries are coming together to see, and they don't have that kind of a domestic manufacturing ability in this particular tech.
So they are dependent on.
They're dependent on a few tech companies which are located in some other place, and now so they want to lower the barriers so that others can participate. There's more diversity. There's more competition,
because it
probably,
and the reason is that it lowers their national security risks, right? It makes it more kind of less reliant on Chinese systems, and given its preponderance in the telecommunications industry, I think that might be a huge kind of factor for at least the Quad to invest in this.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
So the term open is kind of not very clear. So it means that there are standardized interfaces. You can take components from different vendors, can plug and play together. You can build your own network. The operators can build network with different components from different vendors. Now, there are concerns which come with that. So if there was an issue earlier,
So just to also mention, I think it also involves open source software, right? So in terms of it may or may not, that's not a critical part of good open source.
Open RAN does not mean that it's built on open source software. It could be a part of some of the components could be built using open source software, but a lot of them need not be. Open RAN is more about these standardized interfaces which allow interoperability between the subcomponents. So how those subcomponents are built is...
If I were to characterize, it's more about hardware security than software security. I mean, in terms of choosing multiple vendors and trying to understand how to be cost effective about interoperability between those components is what characterizes kind of Open RAN.
So this interoperability, and now that comes with its own challenge. So if you are buying your entire system from one vendor and you face some problem, there is a network security issue or there's something not working, you know who to hold responsible to come and address that or to maintain it or fix it or whatever it is. Right? But if you as an operator are in charge of
choosing 10 different vendors,
if something's not working, it's a more complex system to deploy and to get running smoothly. And there's additional challenges with that. So maybe there's some security lapses when you bring these different components together. Maybe the interfaces, not everyone is working as expected, and there might be challenges there. And when you're trying to build such a system with different components, there's additional complexity involved. So, and this complexity is not something that operators have been doing for a long period of time so that they know everything about it. Right? So they have usually relied on one operator to come and to purchase the equipment from and deploy it. Now, this additional complexity of integrating it and makes it harder. So those are some of the challenges, and that's something that needs to be overcome. A lot of these kind of initiatives under ISET or under the Quad, they're trying to focus on actually overcoming these challenges. How do you create that knowledge base? How do you create a proof of concept so to show that it actually works when deployed in a live system? So those are the things
before we jump to recommendations that you kind of discuss in this document, recommendations for Open RAN deployment. I think one point we could be more clear about is, what kind of pushes us to, kind of embrace Open RAN? So you mentioned Chinese risk, you mentioned kind of involving a lot more players in the system, making it more democratic, kind of putting standards and norms in the telecommunication industry. But other than that, for you and I, who are, I use a geo kind of network, somebody else uses another operator. For the common man, let's say, how exactly do these, does it matter to us that we have an open, sure, it makes it more secure. It makes the systems more secure.
The common person, I don't think it matters what's going on. You just need your phone to work and you expect the network to be reliable. And it could be as reliable or even more reliable with the current way of doing things. Open RAN is more of an advantage to the operator. It gives them vendor diversity and all of that, right? So for the end user, I don't think there's really much of a difference.
Yeah.
Even in terms of security. So like we said, Open RAN adds more complexity, more vulnerabilities amongst these different components. So it does not guarantee that the end product is more secure or could be equally secure, but it doesn't guarantee anything. It depends on a lot of other factors.
But I think with the other option, Open RAN does kind of, given its, at least with the focus on hardware security, your concerns are alleviated, right? In some sense, the fact that, there are standards and norms in place, unlike someone like Huawei kind of setting telecommunications networks in Africa, we don't know what standards they follow, what norms they follow. So in comparison to that, you might say that it's more secure, but as you said, it's not a given. Like it might be. Is that what
the thing is? If you're saying that a Chinese vendor deploying a network is not secure, and that's been proved that it's not. There are suspicious risks, potential risks involved.
They obviously are.
There are suspicions, there are allegations and all of that. So let's assume that there is a risk involved. So an Open RAN system might be, more secure than that. Or even if you go with another vendor, even that might be more secure than.
Yeah.
Right. So if you go with a different non-Chinese vendor, so even that you might not be as vulnerable. And Open RAN provides the other benefits that about diversity and in the long term, maybe resilience in that supply chain, not necessarily in the hardware or in the software.
Interesting. So, one of the aspects is security, but I think there are other aspects like supply chain resilience and infrastructure resilience and so on that Open RAN folks. I think that's interesting because when I read the document, I think which our listeners should definitely read. From the news cycle itself, I also got the sense that primarily the concern was security when it comes to this particular industry. But I think, this might equally be about supply by, making these supply chains resilient and kind of inculcating vendor diversity. Right. It makes the headline. Right. So, and finally, just let's speak about, these recommendations that you provide for, kind of enhanced deployment of an open radio access network. So there's a couple of them. I think one that caught my attention was that, one of them is, of course, that Open RAN mitigates the risk of deploying Chinese vendor equipment. I think that we've spoken about that in particular, but let's focus on the Indian case with respect to this particular recommendation. So you mentioned that, rather than banning Chinese vendor equipment, it would be more intelligent to selectively source, non-intelligent. That means an equipment that's not capable of, let's say, snooping on them. You could choose those kind of equipments, and that kind of alleviates a lot of concerns about infrastructure, about cost effectiveness and so on. So just speak about that. What has been India's concerns with respect to, let's say, Chinese telecommunications, the network and so on, and the equipment that they have, and just like what have the bans done? What have they tried to kind of do?
Bans have been against non-trusted vendors, and so any equipment from those vendors is not allowed to be deployed in the networks. So what Open RAN gives us the possibility is that you can source certain components which you do not see as a very high risk.
Which might these be? Like, let's say
these might be the radio units which are deployed in large numbers at each cell tower. So
they can't snoop, obviously.
So their functionality is limited to transmitting the messages that they receive onto convert that
we sent on the
air, right, to the mobile phone. So it's basically translating it from the digital form to the radio form and vice versa, so that communication, over-the-air communication happens. Now, the purpose is limited to just this. It does not have any other intelligence. It does not have visibility to a lot of the data that's inside, or which user might actually be sending it. All of these details are not visible for this component. So these you might be able to get a cost advantage if you source it from a Chinese vendor compared to a European vendor. So one potential possibility is that Open RAN, it allows you to source different components from different vendors. So maybe source these non-intelligent, low-risk components from a Chinese vendor, and so you can still build your RAN system and at a lower cost possibly than it would be otherwise. So that's one suggestion that we made. So the feasibility for this is something that we hope to have a discussion around and get more clarity about when we talk to other stakeholders as well. So just recommendations about building a proof of concept so that, for example, at least in its initial stages, Open RAN deployments might be more expensive than a traditional conventional RAN deployment. So, and it's more complicated as well to deploy. So a lot of operators might not be willing to pursue this kind of a thing, right? So even as a lot of the market predictions say that it's going to be another 5 years or maybe longer before it starts seeing significant volume of deployments. So a proof of concept kind of a thing where this is something actually that's being worked on with under the ISET or even under the Quad, that states are investing money to deploy these things in live networks and to show that it is feasible to have this running and that it works. So this is something that once it's shown as a proof of concept, others are more willing to adapt it.
So, I have one question. So, with respect to India's interest in deploying Open RAN, there might be, when we talk about the Quad, all 4 countries might have different interests with respect to, why they wish to, deploy Open RAN. But with respect to India, is there a very, what kind of factors shapes? Obviously we talked about Chinese vendor risk, but are there other kind of, specifically with the Indian case, are there other factors that push the government to, deploy Open RAN effectively? Push for its deployment?
There should not be a push for it from the government because there are other risks involved. Above all, you want your networks to be secure, to be reliable.
Yeah.
You don't want a more complicated, difficult to maintain network, which is not stable, that's deployed. So it'll take some time for that confidence to be built, for that capacity to be built. And the other factors about supply chain resilience and all of that are a concern for everybody. So
for everybody, right?
And that'll take some time. And those are the same concerns which are there for India.
Great. That's it from us. Thanks so much, Bharat, for hanging around and speaking about Open RAN. I know more than I did at the start of the episode about Open RAN. Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Bharat. Nice talking to you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.